And I would like to welcome our speaker for today, Mark Meltonville. Mark has worked in numerous museums over the years, looking at many aspects of general social history. He prefers what is known as long view history, where you step back from the object you're studying and try to put it back into the world it came from. For the last 25 years, he has worked as food historian for the historic royal palaces, working on world famous projects to bring to life the Tudor kitchens of Hampton Court, the royal kitchens at Kew Palace, and the chocolate kitchen of King George II. Mark has also presented dining events at Kensington and Buckingham Palaces and Hillsborough Castle, the Queen's residence in Northern Ireland. Now Mark works as a consultant food historian and lectures on many diverse subjects across the UK and the world, from 18th century distilling and brewing in Virginia to 4,500-year-old feasting at Stonehenge. Last year, Mark took the story of roasted lamb to discerning audiences across Japan, and currently he is helping research, design, and rebuild a Tudor brewery. And today he is going to be presenting on brewing at Newlin for us. So welcome, Mark. Let's
Hi there. Right.
Here.
We're going to press a load of buttons, and if this takes less than 20 minutes, we're better than LA last week. Okay. So I press that twice. I press that twice. Oh, hey, we're better than LA. We've done all right. All right. I just need to make me go away so that you can't see me staring myopically at my notes. There we go. All right. Why am I bookending these talks? Well, I think it's because of the pandemic, because there's no way you'd have flown me back for another go this year. But it's very nice to be back virtually at Newlin Mill giving another talk. And I was asked, what can we do? Could we do something about the work that we did before all this when we made some beer at Newlin Mill? I am really lucky because this slide is now irrelevant. I was hoping that might happen. Laura has mentioned so much about what I do that you all know. I travel around and I get really lucky because I get to work in beautiful places like this and explore them and try and bring their social history to life with, using the stories of food and drink. So this is going to lead us to a question I get asked, and I apologize to the staff of Newlin Mill for this one, but I get asked, what are you doing here? Why do you then end up in a little mill in Pennsylvania? And the answer is, I actually end up lots of little different places. It's just some of them are famous, but most of them aren't. And everywhere I go that isn't famous, ask the same question. What are you doing here? And the answer is simple. There is good, interesting history everywhere. And I'm always interested in taking part wherever I can. I've known the director of Newlin Gristmill, Tony Shahan, now for 20 years, Tony. And wherever he has ended up working, I've shown an interest and been lucky enough to take part in some of the projects there. So, as Laura said, you have a early 18th century gristmill set in its landscape, trying to unpick its stories. So it's all very well saying, well, what can Mark do with his royal hat on? Well, nothing with that. What else can go on? What can we look at? And the reason I was contacted for this project was because something I was doing at a small museum again, see, not palaces, small museum in the south of England, where they had a little tiny 18th century cottage, which happens to have built onto the back of the cottage a small brewery and possibly still room. And there we'd been messing around, trying to bring that space to life, trying to think, well, how does this work? Can we rebuild the equipment? Can we find the recipes and so on? So I'm pottering away, sat in this tiny little space, and believe me, it's quite small, growing away, when the director of Newlin Mill comes up with a set of questions, having seen this. He said, oh, we've got a gristmill, and everyone just thinks of a gristmill as somewhere to grind grain. But there's so much more to the story of any space like this. It's actually a community. Is there anything you can do with what you've been doing to help bring to life? So the questions were simple. Were they doing any brewing at Newlin? Is that something we could add to it? If they did, where would they do it? And what for? That sounds a little bit silly, you know, you brew it to drink. But do you brew it to sell, or is it for local consumption? What goes on? The answers came quite quickly. as I've just said, the mill is not just a mill, it's a community, it's a collection of buildings, it performs lots of tasks. And the mill site very quickly found out that they had a store as well, like a mercantile store that was selling things within the things it was selling. It was selling brewing equipment. And we have to realize that beer is food in the past. It contains a lot of carbohydrate. It's a very good energy food. If you don't drink too much of it, it allows you to get back to work and get on with what you're doing that day. So brewing is very much a thing you need to do for your workers. So a size of site like that was very probably brewing a few times a year, and that beer is going to the families that work there. But it's an economic world. If you've got a bit extra, you sell it. It's not a commercial business. It's simply something else you do to add on to the jobs you do around the site. Where would you do it? Well, the obvious answer with the work that was going on at Newlin was the sort of space like the kitchen that had just been finished at the Trimble House, a kitchen space that is usable for all sorts of things. It's a space that you can take over for a short term and do a project or do a craft or do a job as they would have thought of it in the past. So this space, which all of you around there can now go and visit once they open up again, could be great for cheese making, for the processing of butter, for the making of pies or something for a special event. It's also a good space to use for your every 3-month brewing. So you're not trying to build a brewery. That will be a separate building. And usually if you build a brewery, that is for commercial use because you want to sell all the beer you make. But if you need to make beer for the community that is the mill, then you take over a space a few months a year. This is not supposed to be a history of beer, but without a little history of beer, we can't really get anywhere, and I don't know what your general knowledge on that is. So I thought I'd stick in a little bit of beer history just so we know where we are and what goes on. You can ask questions about the upcoming slides, but do realize that every one of them is a 2-hour lecture. So let's see if we can put to bed some ideas and some myths and do a tiny, tiny bit of beer history just to put us into the right place. Beer has been around for a very long time. That's how I put it. It's a fermented drink, and people have been making fermented drinks for as long as we've had agriculture, and probably a little longer as well. To produce a fermented drink is not that difficult. We'll come to that. And the equipment needed can be made from all sorts of forms. The center picture here is a load of pottery jars from Egypt. It's from a brewery that was an archaeological dig. These people do not have coopered casks. They don't have barrels to ferment things in, so you ferment it in jars. If you want to go really long way back, I always put a little picture of the lady up in the top left there, Ninkashi. She is our oldest connection with brewing. She is the Sumerian, or possibly even earlier, Harappan goddess of brewing. I put her up today because it is pouring with rain here in Britain. And apparently, whenever it rains, you should think of Ninkashi and think good thoughts, because Ninkashi is bringing the sweet water to you again that you might make beer. So rain's not so bad. For those of you near the Newlin site, just up the road, you've got the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. If you want to see some really early beer bits and pieces, go down there. And one of the most beautiful at the bottom right there is a, well, it must be 4-foot long, solid gold beer drinking straw. Beer drinking straw, I hear you say? What's that about? Well, it's the way of drinking early beers in early societies, because the jar you saw is being used to ferment, which means it's got some muck at the bottom. It also might well have some muck floating on the top as well. So the best thing to do is use a straw to drink in the middle. This is an Egyptian picture of someone using a beer drinking straw. He's drinking hek, which is why it says that. Hek is the Egyptian for beer. You will find in beer books lots of people who've written, the Egyptians made beer from bread. Well, the answer is they did a bit. Further archaeobotany research coming out at the moment is showing they made some beer from bread, and they made as much beer without using bread. So this is one of the examples I want to give of the new learning we keep coming up with all the time. Most of what I was taught has now been adjusted very slightly. Let's just jump on century after century. I was also taught that the Romans didn't like beer. We've got a beautiful Victorian interpretation of a Roman feast here. This is just how it probably wasn't, but it looks good. The Latin for beer is cerveza. It's supposed to come from the Gaulish words kermi or somi. We're not really sure. We now realise the Romans did like beer. I was always told they didn't like beer, they drank wine. No, they didn't like other people's beer. They quite liked the beer they made. There were large numbers of breweries around Roman cities. And the beer they didn't like very much is the beer we're going to talk about. Anything made in the north. What's interesting is if you think about this, the two traditions of beer making still run today. The light beers of the southern Mediterranean, the sort of thing we think of as the beers of Latin countries, are completely different still from the darker, stronger beers of the north of Europe. So you've got both sorts coming to America. And you really much went for the lighter beers first and are now transitioning round to understanding the darker beers. How far back can I take English beer? Well, if I actually want to have something written about it, other than just the words, I have to go to a lovely fellow called Walter of Bibbsworth. He's an English knight in the 13th century, and he tends to write down all sorts of observations on things he sees around. Sadly for us, he writes it in rhyme. This is his, supposedly, how to make beer in the 13th century, but I've actually outlined in red the only bit that tells you how to make beer. The rest of it is how to make malted grains. And his description of how to make beer, if we wanted to all follow this, is when your malt is ground in a mill, and hot water has drunk its fill, and skill has changed the wort to ale, then you see you shall not fail. What a wonderful set of instructions to take away and have a go at. Not working too well. There's an awful lot of work to do on how on earth you actually did this. You'll notice I keep hopping backwards and forwards between a term, beer and ale. Pick up a book on beer history if it's been written some time ago, and it will tell you this really simple statement. The word beer refers to malted fermented drinks which have hops in them to make them bitter, and ale classically does not. It has other herbs in it to make them bitter. What do I think of this? Yeah, it sort of works, but it's so flexible, it's really, really difficult. It all depends where and when and who and why. So if you're talking about northern Germany, I could tell you that beer has hops in the 13th century. If you're talking about England, I could tell you it probably doesn't until the late 15th or late 16th century. If you're talking about Ireland, I'm going to go, it might not turn up until the 18th century. So it's all flexible. Before I've shown this, people say, what do you mean other herbs? So I put them in. The classic bittering herb for England when they're just making ale without hops is something called ale cost, sometimes called cost Mary. It grows wild still. I just haven't managed to get any. If you're in Europe, they favoured something called bog myrtle, which is not so exciting as a term. It's also known as sweet gale. But both of these herbs do exactly the same job flavour-wise as hops. They're there to make the drink slightly bitter. So the best thing you can do if you're looking for terms in England and in English is follow this. Our Anglo-Saxon word ale, usually pronounced alu, does mean an unhopped fermented malt drink. So if you're looking at the Saxon world, the early Middle Ages, that's true. If you're reading books about the medieval period and the early Tudor period, you can pretty much go down the route saying ale doesn't have hops in, beer does. But now we're going to flick into the history of the Americas. By the 17th century, there's hops in virtually all beers. So the word ale starts to get used again just to mean strong beer. So if it's strong, it's ale, and if it's weak, it's beer. By the time you get to the 18th century, a site like Newlin, those terms have settled down. They'll talk about ale as the strong beer they make for party, and then they'll talk about middle or table beers, which are slightly weaker, and you start to get this term small beer that a lot of people have heard of, which is the drink of the man in the field, people working outside, having a refreshing, and remember that nutritional value, a carbohydrate-filled drink to keep you working. A site like Newlin might well be making all three. You make some strong ale for the parties, you make some table beer for drinking at table, and you make small beer for people working in the mill and outside. If you're running a commercial brewery, they virtually never make small beer. There's not enough money in it. Never forget economics. Once you get into the late 18th century, you start to get this word porter turn up. It's really a transition of a lot of the darker beers. The middle and strong beers are now picking up this name porter, but it isn't the porter that we now know on the beer shelves. It's not quite as dark and it's not quite as oaty. Who made it? Well, there's two lots of people make it, brewers and brewsters. Brewers are men and brewsters are women. Brewing is a very odd profession because right from the start, it seems to be quite equal. A lot of equality in brewing, and in a lot of cases, it biases towards females. In a household where the beer is being made for the community, it's usually brewed and run by women with the help of men. When it's a small scale commercial operation, it's usually mixed. And even by the time you get into the 17th, 18th century, middle-sized breweries, whenever they look at the lists, it's quite often a mixture of male-female. The average they're running at the moment is 5 men to 3 women. Breweries can be run by women. They're often taken over by women when the husband dies. It's a trade where you're not at all surprised to see men or women involved. So we've got quite an equal craft going on there. The bottom one is one of the earliest pictures of what they describe as an alewife. She's got out there called an ale stake, and it's telling you that it's time to brew. This branch that's put up there is often put out as oh, you can see that as a symbol she has beer to sell. Yes, it is, but it's actually more for tax. It's all about tax. My oldest reference to beer happens to be an Anglo-Saxon translation that says every alewife, so every woman that makes beer, must pay her tollister. She has to pay the council tax. This leads me to my earliest picture I have of brewers, and I'm pretty sure that's a man and a woman. I'll fight anyone that says it isn't. We've got both there represented in this very early 13th century drawing of a small brewery having a go, boiling the water up to make something called liquor, and the guy there is stirring what we call the mash, and I think the young lady is testing out the good brew. So a nice mixed job. That'll do for the history of beer for now. We'll go back to the Newlin project. If we thought it was a good idea to try and recreate the beer that they'll be making up in the kitchen there, you need to know how to make beer. I'm going to annoy an awful lot of brewers and a load of home brewers and probably a pile of books on home brewing as tall as me when I say it's actually really simple. You just do this. You make water hot, and when it's hot, brewers call it liquor to try and confuse you. You put this hot water on top of malted grains. Malted grains are grains that have been germinated so that their starches have started to turn to sugar. So you have sugar to get out of the grain. Once you've done this, you sieve it, you throw the grains out to the pigs, and you keep the liquid. You cook that liquid again with hops, we're going to talk about, or with herbs. You sieve out the hops because you don't want it to get too bitter. When it's cool, you put yeast in it so it ferments. After a week, you take the liquid out again, leaving the liquid sludge behind, put it somewhere cool, and drink it. That is it. The craft of brewing is knowing how to stop all the problems that occur at all these stages. So if you know basically how to brew, our question was, what do we need to brew? If we want to do 18th century brewing, what equipment do we need that isn't the equipment of the modern day? And there's lots of different references. There's American references, there's English references, there's all sorts. I was lucky that my mentor and tutor, Peter, had already written quite a lot on the old brewers of England. And so I went straight to him and he handed me this picture saying, here you are, I've drawn a picture of an 18th century brew house, knock yourself out. Which bits do you want to get made? So that gave us a good starting point at the fact that we need a copper kettle to heat up the water or liquor. You need tubs to mash the grains in. You need casks or barrels to store things in. You need stirrers and buckets. So off we went. you need a copper. As I said, it's a large copper boiling pot. If you're only brewing every few months, it's probably not going to be a built-in one. It might be if you're using it for all sorts of different jobs, but it's more likely to be brought in for the brew. If it's going to be on a site that doesn't brew that often, then it's going to be for multiple purposes. So the choice was to go to what's called a domestic copper. The only difference is a brewer's copper has a dented base. The dented base is supposed to allow the flames, the early flames, to heat the liquor quicker. It doesn't matter that much. And I'm sure that the old brewer's copper got used for doing the laundry as well. I was not involved in the manufacture of anything at Newlin, so all questions will have to go to the Newlin staff of where they got it from and who did it and how. But as you can see from the pictures, a beautiful copper turned up, all handmade, riveted together, seamed, and when you'll go out to brew, you need to put the brewing equipment into the kitchen. As you can see, American law dictates that all coppers have to be fitted by men in khaki shorts and blue t-shirts. We followed the rules very carefully there. We also needed something called a mash tun. So it's basically a big barrel, a big tub that allows you to mix that hot water with the malted grains. At this point, we had choices because there are 4 ways of doing it at least. The most common in England, Old English system, was something called a top mashing tun. So it's this, the tub there is coopered wood, but you can see through it. It has this thing called a penstaff. So that's a long wooden staff with a handle on the top that goes all the way down through a hole in the bottom, and it's slightly pointed. And so that holds everything inside. So it's like it's a plug hole. And when you're ready to let your wort, your lovely liquor, come out, leaving the grains behind, you're supposed to raise the penstaff slowly, twisting as you do, allowing the wort, as they call it, to flow down into the bowl. To catch any grains that come through, you need this wonderfully named little bottle here called a wilch. It is a bottle woven from wicker. So a little, and you stuff it full of herbs or moss or something to make a sieve. So that's catching any extra grains that come out. And that was the classical Southern English way of working. But we were looking at early 18th century, so it was decided that we could go for a brand new innovation. This is not seen until the first quarter of the 18th century, and it has the amusing, for children at least, term of a bottom mashing, and contains the wonderful thing, a false bottom. Who doesn't need a false bottom? What's a false bottom? Well, sadly, it's a sieve. So rather than have the sieve outside under the tub and a hole in the tub, which is easy to have it leak, you put a fairly simple spigot or faucet on the side there, and the grains stay on top and the liquid drains from below. It's not that clever invention, but it really does make a big difference. The other thing that they worked out was it's quite useful to be able to add the water, the liquor, to the top and the bottom. So you have this tube on the side that allows you to flush from below and above. Both these things, the false bottom and the top fill, make you, the brewer's life, very interesting and much, much easier. It's a good way to go. What we didn't realize was it takes a lot of work, because we got the lovely tub that was made with the spigot on the side, but you now need a sieve, a false bottom. I am never making a false bottom again, whatever Tony says, because it involved drilling, I think we worked out, nearly 3,000 holes in that piece of oak, only to have it swell up, split and fall apart. And then we made a different one and a different one and a different one. We said this was a learning curve. Well, we're not quite there with everything. The same has to be said for all the different items. It's great fun to work out how to do things, how to evolve your little brewing space. That tube that feeds the water to below the false bottom shouldn't wobble about. So you go and see your blacksmith, and there on the top right, he makes you a little bracket to hold it down using the skills of the time. You need your tub to be raised up so that the spigot doesn't catch the floor. So you need to go and see your woodworkers and have stands made. Between you, you slowly build this brewery together out of necessity. the pictures of all the different tools you need. Again, take them to the various craftsmen you're going to use and get them to have a little go and give yourself a set of tools. See which ones you like, which ones you use more, which ones could be slightly redesigned so they work better. The ladle on both sides, there's a copper one on the left and a wooden one on the right, all seem to have some really interesting names. We would call them ladles. I get a lot of books that call them lets, and in the description from Peter on the other side, apparently they call them jets in the north of England. So more stuff to unpick. The last thing you need once you've built your little brewery and got it ready to rock and roll is you're going to need the ingredients that they were using, and they're fairly simple. They are malted barley or other malted grains as an addition, but we chose to just go for the simple malted barley. So once again, I'll say that's barley that's been germinated and then stopped from germinating, killed, so that you have a much sweeter grain. The starch has turned to sugar. And whole hops. Not so easy to get because most of the brewers around now use pelleted hops. Of course, brewing has moved on and brewers have worked out what's wrong with old brewing. And one of the problems is your hops going off over the year. You only get fresh hops in the summer. And so by May time, they're getting a bit manky. So if you turn them into hop pellets, it works a lot better. That's better for modern brewers and bad for us because we have trouble getting hold of them. This is all part of the project, seeing where you can find things. What do you have at Newlin? Well, you have the thing I don't have a lot of other places. You can go that one extra stage because you have the mill. You can grind your grain. You can actually go through the entire process. This is what made it so exciting to be at Newlin and to put our malt grain, our barley, through the mill and learn another phase. Learn that grinding for a brew is not the same as grinding for flour. It's like when people grind corn in America, there's a different way of grinding grits than there is from grinding corn flour. Well, it's the same for brewing. You don't want flour. You want a different sort of cracked grain. It took a while to work out how to do this and what we needed to do. All part of the learning that goes on in the background. With all of that, we needed to just get started. I dug out a recipe that seemed to be quite fitting for the time of Newlin's building. And so you don't need to read all this. It's just a way of making. It tells you how to go through the process, how to make your beer. So we've got something to follow. And well, of course, we wanted to keep period accurate. So in went Laura as a brewster and had a go at moving the hot liquor into the bowls backwards and forwards. Now, even though there's a deep silence, I can feel a slight shudder here from my audience going, that's not really fair. You guys have put all this kit together and you said that brewers and brewsters were equally matched. Where's the guys? Well, no, don't worry. The guys were working there too. Don't you worry. No, we all took our turns and did as much work each. It is quite hard work, but it's also a lot of sitting around. You realise that brewers had an awful lot of time to come up with another invention because everything is pour this, now wait an hour, pour that, now wait an hour. See what, so there's lots and lots of hurry up and wait. But it was really good fun. It was an enjoyable way of learning. And look, you're getting beer. What's not to like? We started off and you saw the thing you signed up to was an English ale in an American kitchen. We've talked about the kitchen space and how we filled it with a brewery, but why? Why get me to do it? What goes on? Well, it's basically period correct. A lot of English brewers came across the Atlantic and set themselves up in the United States. So there were a lot of English, Irish, Dutch, German, all sorts of brewers around. In fact, many of the brewers left Europe as just a brewer's assistant and somehow magically turned up on the shores as a master brewer. Quite exciting. They must have learned a lot on the boat. So your brewers around there came from the European tradition and used European recipes, grains, and techniques. They also used a lot of European grain. The humidity of the East Coast does not suit barley. So not only did you have European brewers come over with their recipes, a lot of the grain was coming from England and Europe. This carries on right until the late 19th century, when the beer style that we now think of as the American style of beer is developed in large breweries in the cities like Boston and Philadelphia. So prior to that, your beer would have been recognizable to anyone in Europe from wherever they came from to meet their counterparts. And the beer went to lovely little taverns dotted around on the roads in the cities. This one reminded me very much of City Tavern in Philadelphia. And you know what? It would be so nice one day to be able to drink the historic beer in a setting like this. One can dream anyway. But those days are a little way off, I think. A lot of woodwork in there. Hopefully, once we can all get together again, there'll be some more brewing at Newlin and we can produce another brew which becomes another fundraiser. That's a very good aim. But we aren't quite there yet. We can get so far, and then we have to learn more. A lot of people wouldn't show this sort of thing. I'm quite happy to admit how far we've got and where we've got to go. We're not finished, we've started. When our beer a couple of years ago left the fermenters, it then had to go into modern casks. Now, part of that is modern food codes. You want to serve it to people, it has to be up to code. But also, we are not yet able to complete the process. It's getting better. If you see on the picture on the left, this year in February, we managed to move the fermented beer to a wooden cask. So another step up. Before we even come close to our historic counterparts. New information is coming up. This is entirely separate. I haven't been over to the States since March, but being stuck in my little office, I have a mound of books to read and a few lectures to give, so I can keep on researching. And one of the things that I've discovered finally is what we call the beer ratio. This has been eluding us for quite a long time. Again, you don't need to read the whole thing. When you put water in to make beer, you get less out than you started with. It gets soaked up by the grains, it gets evaporated, it gets spilt. Is there any way of knowing how much you need to start with to get so much out at the end? Because a lot of their recipes say this makes 36 gallons of beer, or a hogshead, or describes a barrel, but it doesn't tell you where to start. Mr. Whitaker is one of the first, and I've now found a couple of others where he does tell you that. He tells you how much water you need to heat to get so much beer out. And to simplify all the stuff I've got so far, the basic ratio seems to be coming out at 5 to 3. You need 5 times the water goes in to get a 3 times drink. So new research coming up all the time. That's about where we are, and you should be proud, anyone who's visited it and anyone who works there, because the brewing experiment at Newlin is, I think, one of the only experimental projects in the United States at the moment using period techniques that includes a water-powered mill. Now, you're lucky to have that. It has some of the most up-to-date research coming backwards and forwards from both America and Europe. And more importantly, by doing so, you are adding to the practical experiments at the site, not just brewing, but all the other crafts that go on, from woodworking to baking, all the way through. And all of these add a new dimension to the site to make people understand that a mill is not a mill that stands alone. It's part of a community. So all of these new crafts are doing a deeper job than just amusing people when they come to have a look, and a deeper job than just trying out some beer. I got to finish with a warning. This was a broadsheet printed in the late 17th century, and I have to warn you before we finish. It's all this talk of beer might be fine, but remember that too much, the ale fellow, so too long in a tavern, will lead to a life of debauchery and end with a rope round your neck. Be warned, be temperate. Thank you, everybody. I'll be back soon-ish. I'm not sure when it's going to be, when we're allowed back across the pond, but it's certainly not this year, and it's probably heading for a year before we can get back. But I look forward very much to being able to take part in projects both at Newlin and at other sites across the US very soon. Now it's time for a mound of questions. Right. What do I have to do, Laura?
Let's see, turn your video back on. There we go. Now we can see you. And if anyone has questions, go ahead and type them in the chat. Nope, you are muted, Mark.
Got you. It was
There we
you.
go.
You sadly, you'd muted me.
I didn't mean to. Can we get a copy of the slides? We will be posting a video of the presentation on our website under the Newlin series section. Okay, Susan asks, how long does a batch of ale keep?
Well, the answer is how long's a piece of string? And the answer is always 2 inches too short. It will keep. I like to drink it within a month of it being ready. So it takes about 15 days to clear. And then we're finding that our stuff that's not kept in modern conditions, by the end of another 4 weeks, is starting to acquire a slightly sour tint to it. It's starting to tail off. If you give up and head into the modern world and start putting it in bottles or cans, then you're going to have the same keeping time as anybody else. But all the stuff that we make that's period beer, we normally say about a month after clearing. So 6 weeks after making, it starts to tail off. I had a disappointing bottle the other night that was from early summer, and it's been doing all right up until now. And just last week, there was this hint of sour in the background. So that was starting to tail off.
All right.
There are recipes to stop re-ferment sour beer if you end up with lots of it.
Lara asks, what about barley malt? Nowadays, breeds are different from period malts.
Oh, yeah. That's the work in progress. Is how do you find the heritage grains? It is the difficult part. There are strains around. You can dig about. The more you dig about, the better. The actual flavour. I've just finished a test run of an 18th century variety called Chevalier, which has a very small crop in Europe. And the first thing that struck us is it's very light in taste. Now, as this is the first time we've been able to use such a rare breed, I don't know whether the skill level is the fact that anyone who used that one would probably have turned around and said to me, well, you need to have it soak longer. But as we hadn't used it before, compared with the more modern grains, it has a much lighter taste. For a project that might happen next year, if things open up, we've got a couple of fields on Orkney growing a strain from the 16th century. But now I'm nervous about how long do you steep that. So all of this is part of the learning curve. We need more access to old grain. The problem is the older grains are usually not so stable. They're not as disease resistant, and they blow over in the wind, so no one wants to grow them for you.
All right, Wayne asks, how was the Wilch fastened under the pen staff under the mash tun?
Yes. There are about 3 surviving ones that are left over in a photo from the 1940s, and the actual object seems to have gone from the museum now. It looks as if they have a wooden ring in the. If you imagine a bottle made of wicker, quite small, probably only 6-8 inches long, like a little bottle. Where the neck is, there's a wooden ring that fits over a pipe underneath. But all of that is just drawings and ideas. I personally think it's going to need a peg through it, probably. So a peg tap through. Otherwise, it's just going to fall off. So answers on postcards, but we're leaning towards putting a peg on there. So a peg through the wicker and through the spout.
Marianne asks, are there any projects like this in other countries or on other continents?
Yes. When we were brewing in February, we were quite in isolation, with the exception of people like Frank, who's down here somewhere. knowing that there were a few other projects in the US that were working well. So down at Williamsburg, they've got a very good brewing program looking at all of these recipes and techniques. In lockdown, if it's done one thing, being stuck in an office for 6 months, I've met so many more people around the world. And a big project in Holland called XARC is now running a brewing chat service. So they're getting all these little disparate people who've all said the same. I didn't think anyone else was doing it. And they're starting to get us together. So we're finding out more and more. An awful lot of people seem to be very interested in very early. So there's a lot of people looking at Neolithic brewing and very, very early brewing. There are less looking at the later centuries. Next one.
Have any others in the queue right now? I'm sure.
Well.
Sure, there have to be other questions.
No, it doesn't matter. People dumbfounded by it going, I don't know what he's on about. The obvious question is, when do we get to do it again? And the answer is, I don't know. It's a long way off, I think.
Let's see. Your son just asked, have you tried making the same recipe both here in the UK and out in America? And does this create much of a difference in taste, difference being created maybe from different water or environments?
The answers, both answers are yes. We've made the Ellis version in both countries. The water and all the environment will make a difference. But the sad answer is, I always leave America before the beer's ready. So I haven't tasted the two yet. So we now need some courier service sending small tins backwards and forwards so we can try the different ones.
Tony, our director, asks, what was the most surprising discovery you made during the project?
How long it takes to drill holes. That's the facetious answer, because both he and I were up till about 1:45 in the morning trying to get that damn thing done. I think it's not so much surprising, and it's not one project. It's as the projects unfold around, I'm starting to realize that as a group, if we're starting to become a group of historic brewers, we have to make sure that we realize that the modern world of brewing is really, really interesting and extremely correct, but has very little to do with what we do. The world of modern brewing is a product of Louis Pasteur's science. So if you go to brewing school, you will learn about all the things that make good beer, and they are true. And all the problems with yeast and all of that is true. But we're trying to work with people's ideas and recipes that had found a way around that science, not knowing what the scientific problem was. And if we're not careful, we can become confused by the modern answer. And so that's been my surprise overall. For Newlin, I think I was surprised that I could work in such a cold environment this year. We don't do that in Europe.
It was rather chilly.
Celsius. Minus 11 Celsius. We die in Europe at that.
And it really was a mild winter.
No, it wasn't.
Let's see. Frank asks if you have the contact information for the Dutch project, and Katie asks if you have the link for the ale chats for people who might be interested in
both
joining.
of those. Yes, to Frank, and I'll send it over. What I'll do is send a link to that to you, so you can put it along with the. But you just have to search a group called XARC, EX, and then ARC. But don't worry if you can't, because I'll send that over to you. It already has quite a large number of American historic brewers within it, and some good ideas.
Yeah, we'll post those links in on the Newlin series page when we post the video as well. Let's see. Can you give a brief idea, Bonnie asks, of what type of government requirements have to be met before starting a brewing program? And maybe I will unmute Tony.
You need to pass that to your director, because I only know that in the UK.
Well, first, a lot of research to figure out what your local state regulations are. And if you're just brewing, you really aren't under a lot of regulations as long as you never intend to drink it. And I know there are a couple of historic brewing projects out in New York that literally they make 200-gallon batches that are sold as fertilizer for farmers, which is a real shame. So that was one of the reasons why we chose to work with modern brewers and work under their licenses, so that as long as we were using the skills that they had, it was also very revealing. It's one of the things that Mark didn't mention a while ago, was the unique aspect of knowing what we were trying to do historically and having a modern brewer go, oh, you're doing blah, 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 blah. And you're going, oh, that's why they were doing it. So it was a lot of that aha moment. But as far as just brewing, I don't know of any regulations. It's when you start to sell a product that it really is when you get into a lot of regulations, and you have to. It's not quite as bad as distilling, but you do have to do a lot of work on the regulatory end.
Yeah, it's the same here. The little brewery I showed that we're working in there, and there's another one in a Tudor building. What's surprising is the brewing was not a problem. The museum does not sell the product at all, but it gives it out as samples weeks later. So you can come back, and if you're touring around, one of the kitchens will have little. What was more difficult was the room you were serving in it had to pass food code to allow that to happen. They didn't seem to care who'd made the beer. It was more about the service. So it's more about protecting your public, it seems to be.
And Tony's wife, Carol, says she doesn't have a question, but wanted to let Mark know that the leftover yeast from the February brew made a great starter and is making great bread. I'm glad to hear that too, because year before's brew that we tried to use some of the leftover yeast did not go well.
No. I've had about the same 50-50 where it's worked sometimes and other times it hasn't. I'm really pleased about this, and this is going to have to be noted down. Tony, myself, and several other people here are part of another chat group, which is bread discussions every fortnight. And one of the things they're interested in is the connection between brewers and bakers. Nowadays, brewers and bakers are a world apart. They don't like each other. They don't like each other's yeast. In the past, we know that brewers and bakers shared yeasts, and the fact that some yeast from a brew in February is still making good bread now in October is really interesting, and we need to note that down.
I personally think part of the key was all the time we took washing it.
Yes, yeah, that's another lecture entirely, isn't it? Washing your beer yeast to get good beer. We can all do a practical day.
Michael says he was surprised to learn in the project that the brewing was more about the hot water pours than the fermentation process.
I think it's fair to say that every stage, my nice facetiously, how easy beer is to make, is that every one of those stages has so many variables and so many ways of making it better or worse. And that's what we mean by the way we say craft. When you talk to a craftsman, be it a blacksmith or a baker or a miller or a carpenter, their skill is in spotting something before it goes wrong and knowing how to deal with it, or deal with it quickly when it goes wrong. And brewing's the same. So at every stage you can do things and you can change what goes on. But it's about the everything. The fermentation is just one stage of a flavor range. Right. How are we doing?
Oh,
everyone's been here a while now. And, they are welcome to. Once it gets to nearly an hour, there's no shame in going away.
All right. Well, I don't see any new questions popping up here. I want to thank Mark for joining us remotely today. I'm glad that the technical aspects seem to go well. That doesn't always happen. And we thank everybody for coming today, and we are glad that so many people could join us virtually. We hope to be able to welcome folks back to the site soon. Tony, did you want to say anything before we end this?
Well, mostly just when we are able to open again, I want to invite everybody in, because the beer making is one of just a multitude of experimental projects that we are running currently, including our 18th century millwright shop, where we're rebuilding our wooden water wheel and flume using all period tools. We are furnishing that kitchen that you saw. That the first thing we had in it was the brewery, but we are preparing to turn it into an experimental kitchen to do a lot further study of 18th century foodways. So I invite everybody to come back when we can, and hopefully within just the next 2 to 3 weeks, we'll have the trails open for everybody. That's been what our goal has been recently. So, and thank you all for coming out today.
Yeah, thanks everyone from a virtual trip from Europe. It's been great. Thank you. I'll see you all again. Cheers.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Mark. Bye.
Bye. Lots of virtual waving. Lots of virtual waving.